4 years ago this week, the worst natural disaster ever to strike this country hit the Texas coast. 6,000 people were killed on Galveston Island in the Great Storm of 1900. Our Charles Hadlock reports tonight some of those who died are now being remembered.
Galveston has never turned its back on the Gulf, but it has put up a wall. For most of this century, the wall has protected the city from powerful hurricanes, but it cannot protect it from the painful memory of what happened here during the Great Storm of 1900. St. Mary's Orphanage was built away from town to isolate the children from the yellow fever and other deadly diseases that had claimed their parents. 10 Catholic nuns ran the orphanage. In the summer of 1900, 93 children lived there. The orphanage was built just a few feet from the sandy beach. On September 8, 1900, the sisters looked out from the orphanage and knew something was wrong.
They could see it coming in, and that they knew the wind was getting higher and higher.
Julia Wilson's father, Frank Madera, was one of the boys in the orphanage. He and the other children were told to prepare for a storm. Earlier that day, Sister Elizabeth Ryan had gone to town to gather provisions. She stopped by St. Mary's Infirmary to visit the sick.
The sisters here at the hospital tried to encourage Sister Elizabeth Ryan to stay. And they said, just wait till after the storm passes. And she said, no, she said, I have to get back to the orphanage. She said, because I have the provisions in the wagon, and if I don't get back, the orphans will have no supper tonight. She didn't know that whether she made it back or not, there would be no more suppers at the orphanage.
The sisters at the orphanage moved the children from the boys' dormitory to the new Stronger Girls building next door.
And they sang an old French hymn called Queen of the Waves. And they sang that song trying to keep the children calm.
With the surf rising, everyone moved to the second floor, including 13-year-old William Murney. Murney had lived in the orphanage only a short time. His mother had just died of tuberculosis, and his father died the very next day of a heart attack. Now, his own life was in peril.
He recounted a long evening of fear, the winds howling, raging, and the water rising. The water came in to the lower floor.
And each sister took a section of rope and tied one end to a child and the other end to the cincture that they wore around their waist. And each sister tied to herself between 6 and 8 orphans.
Suddenly, a giant wall of water crashed into the empty boys' dormitory next door.
And that increased the fears of the children, and they started to scream. And the sisters tried to calm them down and had them again sing Queen of the Waves.
Some of the orphans looked up in time to see a ship smash into the last remaining building at the orphanage.
The orphanage was lifted from its foundation. It floated for a few minutes, and then the roof caved in, trapping the sisters and the children in the water.
The whole building seemed to collapse at once.
William Murney grabbed his younger brother.
He was holding his brother, his 8-year-old brother. And he thinks a beam hit him, and he never saw his brother again. And he had recollections of being in the cold water, but those were very vague. And he says the real thing that he remembers most was waking up in a tree.
3 boys survived the storm by clinging to a tree. Everyone else died in a watery grave.
One of the scenes he did recall is after he was awakened and was in the tree, seeing some of the bodies of the nuns floating by with 2 or 3 orphans tied to them.
Eventually, the boys were rescued.
Men, he said, were either sailors or people from Galveston that had a small boat that came by and picked them up.
By daylight, the boys could clearly see how truly lucky they were. 6,000 people had died during the night. Many bodies, including those of the nuns and children, were buried where they were found. Others were loaded onto barges and carried out into the Gulf. The young survivors grew up quickly. William Murney lived at St. Mary's Infirmary after the storm and helped the nuns there care for the injured. He later lied about his age and got a job with the railroad. Murney stayed in touch through letters to the other two boys with whom he spent that terrifying night together clinging to a tree. But over time, they drifted apart. Now, 94 years later, the state of Texas is honoring the nuns and children lost in the orphanage. The descendants of the three survivors will attend the dedication of a marker placed near the site of the orphanage. The marker sits on the wall that protects the city, but it cannot protect it from a painful memory. Charles Hadlock, 11 News, Galveston.
Mitch was born on the 21st of October in the warm waters near the equator. The sun heats the surface of the sea, evaporating 1 trillion tons of water into the air each day. So once in the air, where does it all go? At about 2,000 feet up, the water vapor cools and condenses back into tiny water droplets. This is the dew point. It's where all clouds are born. Each single cloud is made up of billions and billions of water droplets. Carried aloft by the rising warm air, they billow upwards. If the heat from the sea below is strong enough, they grow into massive tropical storms. The 22nd of October 1998 began as a normal day. At the National Hurricane Center in Miami, it was a day they would never forget. Way out in the Caribbean, a major storm system was building.
It developed quite fast after it became a tropical storm. For several days we were monitoring this cluster of thunderstorms in the air and in the Caribbean, but we knew that it was going to be a threat somewhere in the Caribbean.
In the capital city of Honduras, Tegucigalpa, people were oblivious to the gathering storm out to sea. It was hurricane season, and this part of the world is used to it. As it spun towards Honduras, sucking up vast amounts of water, the wind speeds picked up. At 75 miles an hour, Mitch officially became a hurricane. It was picking up 2 billion tons of water vapor each day, which inevitably has to fall somewhere. On the 27th of October, it was business as usual in the capital.
We were in direct contact with the forecast office in Honduras, Nicaragua, Belize, Central America, and in fact, the hurricane was so large that we knew that it was going to affect with rain and strong winds all the north coast of Honduras. So the warnings were up like 20 hours in advance.
The next day, Hondurans began to prepare for the worst. Out at sea, the warm waters of the Caribbean fuel the cycle of evaporation and rain. By now, Mitch had been rated a Category 5 hurricane, the most lethal on the potential damage scale. In Tegucigalpa, Pedro Funes and thousands like him were on their way to work. By the evening of the 29th of October, Mitch had already reached the northern coast.
In this case, the destructive power now is contained in the very, very heavy rains that are being released as the circulation interacts with a very mountainous landmass here, Honduras and Nicaragua down here. And it draws in moisture both from the Pacific Ocean and from the Caribbean Sea, from both sides. And the circulation is so large that it's very slow to spin down.
Mitch was so big that while its center covered the land, its spinning edges sucked up vast amounts of water vapor from the Pacific and the Caribbean. It then poured it straight back down again onto the land.
And so the real disaster is really yet to come in terms of the mudslides and the very great catastrophes that occur as a result of several feet of water being deposited over the mountainous terrain here.
The water racing down from the mountains was funneled into the valleys at terrifying speeds, wiping out anything in its path. Residents watched in horror as friends and neighbors were swept away, along with whole neighborhoods. In the capital, Tegucigalpa, mudslides washed whole shantytowns into the river. One of those houses belonged to Pedro Funes, and this is all that's left. When the cliff collapsed, Pedro lost his entire family. By the 31st of October, Mitch had disintegrated, and the remnants moved away out into the Gulf of Mexico.
The hurricane is both a miracle of nature and it's a monster. When the meteorologist looks at it from afar, he admires it as a thing of beauty and something that I think a lot of people would look at, even non-meteorologists, and say, wow, that's something really spectacular. But at the same time, we recognize that the more beautiful it looks, probably, the more potentially destructive it's going to be.
From the rubble of his home, Pedro was only able to find one body, that of his youngest son, Javier. On a quiet hill above the city, survivors paid their last respects.
Quiero pedirte pues que
Dios me lo dio.
season's first hurricane lashes the coast of southwestern Louisiana. Hurricane Audrey, spawned in the Gulf of Mexico, sweeps in across Cameron Parish with terrific winds and rain. An estimated 350 persons lost their lives, many of them swept into the Gulf of Mexico by the backwash of tidal waves. The most tragic news story of recent months is one of horror and destruction. With thousands homeless and facing a grim future, Cameron was hardest hit with millions in property damage. But Audrey also cut a swath of destruction inland through the U.S. and on into Canada. President Eisenhower declared hard-hit portions of Louisiana and Texas major disaster areas, eligible for federal aid. It was the worst storm in Louisiana in 100 years. Neither man nor animal was spared as the devastating storm swept in from the sea. For the first few days, rescue workers were too busy trying to care for the living to pay heed to the dead. But now, as the tidal waters recede, the gruesome estimates of death become mounting statistics. Red Cross Director Grunther and former Civil Defense Administrator Val Peterson make plans for a tent city to care for as many of the victims as possible. While the search for the dead continues from dawn to dusk, efforts to make the living victims comfortable continues around the clock. It will take years to rebuild the towns and farms which wind and water smashed to rubble in only a few short, terrifying hours.